You've got the Think Christian podcast, where we believe there's no such thing as secular, and we really, really like to talk about Star Wars. We're going to visit a distant corner of the Star Wars galaxy on this episode, talk about Star Wars: The Bad Batch. This is a spin-off of the animated series, The Clone Wars. Now, the occasion for doing this is a bit grimmer than we normally associate with Star Wars. The first half of this year has seen a rash of gun violence in the United States. And as report after report rolled in, my mind went to Isaiah 2, the first 5 verses in particular, where the prophet presents this vision of Zion that is free of weapons, a place where swords are turned into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. That provides some solace as we think about looking forward to the coming of the kingdom of God. But what does it mean for those of us who are living right now in a world prevalent with gun violence? And what does it mean for those of us who enjoy pop culture and see a lot of TV shows or movies where weapons are prominently featured? And that does include something like Star Wars. The Bad Batch also includes an action vehicle for Jason Statham like Wrath of Man. Now, Joe George is going to join me to consider blasters and lightsabers within the context of Isaiah 2. As for Wrath of Man, well, Abiel Chessie took that hit. Abiel Chessie is here with me. Abby, maybe the best thing I can say about Wrath of Man is that it's the first press screening I was able to attend post-vaccination in a theater in about a year. How about you? Have you had a chance to get back in front of a big screen yet?
Oh, wow. No, I haven't been able to get back in front of a big screen. I will get the first opportunity to do that next Wednesday when I see Cruella, which I have some minor hopes for. I know it's gotten a lot of dissing online, but I feel like there are enough people behind it that I like the work of that I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt for a bit.
Yeah. I guess that was my situation with Wrath of Man. I was a bit skeptical, but so eager to get back into a press screen that I was just like, I'm going to go give it a shot. It was a little bit of a rough welcome back for me, I will say. It's a Guy Ritchie film, the director, and I'm very hit or miss on him. Jason Statham, though, the star, and more often than not, I like what Statham does. Here he plays this mysterious character named H. That's all we know about him at the beginning, who gets hired by a Los Angeles armored car company. And pretty soon, one of his first days on the job, robbers come, try to take over the car. There's a heist, and he displays this lethal dexterity in fending them off. So we know right away, there's got to be something to this guy's past, right? And sure enough, there is, and it involves a lot of violence.
The tree has been shook, and it's been shook hard. We've scorched the earth.
You started by saying you'd do anything. But what I'm hearing is, you think you've done everything.
I can see it's going to be a long night.
So how overall, Abby, did Wrath of Man work for you?
I was not super hot on it. I've been actually reading a lot of other folks' reviews to kind of get a sense of how people have felt on both sides of the line. I've been really intrigued to see a few really well-written positive reviews of it. Matt Zollersides had some really interesting things to say about it on Roger Ebert. It's interesting because I feel like both the negative and positive reviews touch on things that I agree with. I feel like maybe some of the positive reviews give Guy Ritchie's filmmaking a little too much credit, but I do agree that the ethos is extremely grim, and that is the point. I think maybe your reaction as to whether or not that amount of grimness is necessary to make a movie like this, or if it works, it kind of is a your mileage may vary sort of a situation. For me, I felt like it was a little overly heavy, and it's a combination of heaviness and lack of deeper meaning, I think. I'm fine with movies that are violent and have something to say when they use that violence. I feel like this is a movie that wanted very much to be in that vein, or at least to be considered alongside movies that do that, but I don't think it does that very well.
It's stretching for a seriousness that it doesn't really earn in some ways.
Yes, yeah.
But it's also really, kind of slick and cheeky too. I do think it's a really good case study for our theme here for this show. I think just this idea that weapons are a way of exerting power, and weapons are all over this movie, just everywhere, almost every scene. And, Isaiah 2 laments this world where power is expressed through violent force. And then, of course, looks forward to a world where that's not the case, no longer be a reality, when there's the portion that says, nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. So if we narrow down to kind of just that lens, Abby, how do you see this idea playing out in Wrath of Man? When you're asking some questions like, okay, who holds the power in this movie? How do they express that through the weapons that they literally hold? And then how do they even employ those weapons? If we look at the movie just kind of like from that particular angle, what stood out to you?
I think there's a real difference in the way that Jason Statham uses his weapons, like the many guns that he employs and carries in this movie, as opposed to the way that the other characters do. Like at the very beginning, he's given his like temporary sidearm, and he sort of tricks Top Brass at the security company that he's working for into thinking he's not a very good shot. Like he barely passes the shooting test. And then of course, like when it comes down to the clutch, like he is just laser precise, which is part of the reason that everybody's questioning like what his past is. But yeah, I think there's a difference in the sense that he is absolutely not afraid to use guns. When the truck is held up, he's given the advice going into the job. This is not his own money that he is transporting and protecting. And so therefore, if the place is held up, he should feel totally fine with just letting the robbers take what they need and not getting in the way and not doing the whole hero thing because they're like insured. But of course, when it does happen, he is extremely violent. Like he does exactly what he's not supposed to do. And his coworkers are freaking out because they don't want to get involved. Josh Hartnett, who's driving the van, when it gets held up, is like asking him, like, what are you doing? You're a psychopath. Why are you doing this? When he just provokes the robbers into violence by he takes a bag and he throws it to the side of the truck instead of in the truck and makes them angry. And that's the point. He wants to make them angry so that he can provoke them. And just, and the way that he holds his gun is different too. Like he is super casual with it. Like he usually shoots, like when he's got the pistol in his hand, he's shooting it with a single hand. There are a couple of shots where he shoots dudes and he doesn't even look them in the face. Whereas, most of the other characters are, I think, more tactical. They hold their weapons with both hands and are frequently making jokes toward each other about their lack of masculinity. And H is a person whose masculinity you never question and you never joke about, like from minute one.
Yeah, that was the rough part for me, I think, is that actually how H does hold his weapons as you're describing, because it's a very callous way, but the movie also seems to want to justify it. And we probably shouldn't get into spoilers specifically about the backstory, but it does want to present his use of violence as a form of justice, or, certainly revenge and vengeance is what's driving him. It's why he doesn't just follow procedure and sit back during the heist. He has another goal in going after the robbers, right? He's trying to figure something out, and he's using a gun to do that. And you're right about the holding it, not even looking at the victims often. And he kind of pulls the trigger in other instances, like a punchline. He'll deliver a line, and then the bullet is the punchline. And then it gets murky too, because so often, especially in that middle section where the movie goes really dark and we kind of get more into this criminal underworld that he pursues people in, the movie is very specific to point out that, but the people he's shooting are even worse people. They're guilty of even more despicable crimes. And so then the implication, to me at least, is that we as viewers are supposed to be okay with the violence that he's committing. And so I think this is maybe particularly true in that final confrontation. We won't say with who, but this speaks to the seriousness you were talking about, where the movie thinks it's maybe more important than it is. It has these subheads, these titles that come up every 20 minutes or so. And the last subhead we get is liver, lungs, spleen, and heart. And then what we see is there's a confrontation where H delivers a bullet in each of those places. And it's this kind of stylization of his violence that's making it clever and entertaining at the same time. And so even though I think the movie is trying to distinguish him from the others who are wielding weapons, I don't know that I buy the way it's trying to distinguish him. I mean, the film overall fetishizes weaponry. You think about when we first take that tour through the armored car company, they talk about how we've upped our game, and they show him all the guns they have stacked up. It's stocked like an army barracks, basically. I saw the distinction they're trying to make between those guys and H, but I don't know if I bought the justification for it in terms of his backstory. Did that give you any pause at all?
Yeah, it gave me pause. Something that appeared in Matt Zoller Seitz's review that surprised me is that he seems to think that we're not supposed to sympathize with any of the characters. And I would agree that none of them I find very sympathetic, H included, and that there's sort of an undertone of lament to a lot of the action. He says, and the last line of his review is, every character made their bed and must lie in it. More often than not, it's a deathbed. I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, less in terms of justification and more in terms of just consequence in sort of a earthly, like very earthly and very human sense.
Yeah.
I don't know that makes for very meaningful filmmaking. I think it's really nihilistic. I don't think there's much of a conversation that the movie is having with itself, if that's the way that you look at it. And that, I think, is part of the reason that I find some of that drama lacking. But I think even if we are supposed to see H as a sympathetic character, I feel like that makes it even worse, just because some of the stuff that he goes through is definitely bad, but the way that he chooses to respond to it, I don't think there's really any justification for. I think there's a lot of soul searching and a lot of character exploration, I think, to be had if that's what you want to get out of that situation. And that's not really something the film offers.
Yeah. And in a way, he is. So the tragedy that kicks off his mission of vengeance, he is somewhat responsible for, just in the decisions he's made in his own life beforehand. So I think the movie does implicate him, even as it wants us to maybe not be sympathetic, but again, see him as the least bad of all these bad guys,
right?
who we're spending this couple of hours with. And I also, that even is at odds for me with some of the stylization, which I think goes back to Guy Ritchie as a filmmaker. Mm-hmm. It's not just the intertitles, but during that vengeance sequence, that really dark, violent sequence that happens about in the middle of the film, there's also this use of a distorted remix of Johnny Cash's Folsom Prison Blues.
Yeah.
That, and that's the song with the line, "My mama told me, son, always be a good boy. Don't ever play with guns." And the use of it here is just, again, like, yeah, we know we're trying to push buttons and this is, material that might put some people off, but we're also going to have some fun with it. Mm-hmm. And we're going to make it really exciting. And that's kind of where I think some of the hypocrisy for me seeps in. I did wonder, Abby, if you saw anything in the movie, if we're trying to be charitable, is violence ever mournful in Wrath of Man, in a way that, you can sense in Isaiah here, this notion that right now we do live in a world of warring and weapons, and there's something to be mourned there. Can this movie even imagine a kingdom without swords? One with only plowshares? Or is it kind of happy to be in this realm of bad guys and their guns?
I think that's a really good question. I think if there is any mournfulness to it, I think it does come in that middle section where there's a potential for us to imagine characters whose lives are not primarily about violence and seeing what happens to those characters, and maybe mourning the loss of characters who shouldn't have had to be involved in a thing that they get secondarily involved in, and paying the price for it. I feel like, not to spoil too much, but that is directly connected to Jason Statham's character's pain and his anger.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I feel like there's a sense of mournfulness in that. I think he knows that it's worth mourning when people who have relative innocence end up getting caught in the crossfire of something. But the response to that, I think if you're grieving somebody and really kind of thinking about them in a selfless way, I don't think that that's necessarily a great response. Is getting retributive violence on their behalf. Like I don't know that would make anybody happy. And I think there's also a sense that I think Statham's character only really seems like he's fulfilling a purpose when he is being violent. But even then, it doesn't seem to make him very happy. So he's not necessarily having a good time with it. He's not gleeful with it. I think it's just the way that it is. And maybe there's something in that coldness that suggests that there's been a level of humanity lost with him that exists in some of the other characters still, like shreds of it, who are maybe a little less eager to jump to violence and defense as a first thought.
Yeah, and that connects with how much you see the ending too. I think as this cathartic experience for him, or one that still leaves him feeling maybe empty and unfulfilled. Well, on a more positive note, Abby, you were recently at the True False Film Festival. So real quickly, I'm just wondering if you saw anything there that TC listeners might be particularly interested in, can maybe look forward to coming out later in the year. Was there something that jumped out at you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, there were a couple of films. One was Theo Anthony's film, All Light Everywhere. Theo Anthony made the documentary Rat film a few years ago that was also at True False, and that had a pretty strong reception there. And All Light Everywhere did too. It's a really interesting kind of essay-ish film that goes on all kinds of interesting tangents related to surveillance and also related to policing in Baltimore, which is where Theo Anthony lives, and sort of the interestingly intertwined history of photography and criminal profiling and violence, like all three of those subjects kind of woven together in ways that I thought were really interesting. I actually saw that with Eric Danielson together.
Oh, really?
Yeah, on the first night of
Nice.
True False. So yeah, that was a cool thing to watch and discuss. Also, I got to see Questlove's documentary Summer of Soul.
Looking forward to that.
About the Harlem Music Festival in 1969. And I believe most of us are still kind of embargoed from saying too much more about it, but just that I think it's something that a lot of people are going to get a lot out of. I enjoy it when movies feel like a very specific window into a time and a place. And this is something that does that really well and in a way that's celebratory and fun.
Nice. Yeah, that one's definitely on my radar. All right. Well, thanks, Abby. I owe you maybe a more pleasant assignment next time. So I'll keep my eye out for something like that. But let folks know where they can follow you, especially as maybe some of coverage of the True False film starts coming out that you're able to do. Where can they keep up with you?
Yeah. You can follow me on Twitter at Abby Olcese, ABBYOLCESE. I will have full write-up coverage of True False coming out in the June issue of Pitch. So that will be out in print and I think online in issue form around June 1st. And it'll be up on the website like a couple of weeks after that.
Nice. All right. Coming up. We'll look for that. Thanks again, Abby.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.
Hey everyone, John J. Thompson, your in-house DJ here, inviting you to check out the special Spotify mix I have curated to correspond with this episode's Swords into Plowshares theme. You can find it by searching for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify, or just check the link in the emails you get from us, or head over to the website. As you know, we can't play any of the music here on the YouTube feed, but I found some great songs out there that deal with this theme, including Killing in the Name by Rage Against the Machine and Put Down That Weapon by Midnight Oil, and many more. And if you have any ideas of songs I should add, just put down your pistol on the table and tweet at me at John J. Thompson, and I will see what I can do. I promise. Until next time, peace. That's an order.
I am happy to welcome back Joe George, a man who loves Star Wars almost as much as he loves Star Trek. Do I have that right, Joe? Can you put percentages on those things at all?
I can put percentages on those things, but I don't want the people to turn off this podcast immediately. So let's just leave it at, yes, I do like Star Wars. Okay. It's a good second best star-based series.
Okay, fair enough. Sounds like we should just leave it at that.
Yep.
Well, let's move on to The Bad Batch then. Star Wars The Bad Batch. New animated series. This is on Disney Plus, a spinoff from the Clone Wars series. Maybe you can set the stage for us here, Joe. I often like to, when I jump back into Star Wars, orient myself by thinking about where I am in the 9-film narrative. So in that sense, are we between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith pretty much here, would you say?
No, I think we're mid Revenge of the Sith.
Okay.
So the series takes place, one of the first things we see is the calling of Order 66, which is the moment when the clone troopers, who are the army of the Galactic Republic, are ordered by then Chancellor Palpatine to kill all the Jedi. And so that's kind of the inciting moment of the series as we see
a betrayal.
A bunch of
at this point.
The betrayal. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The clone troopers attack the Jedi. So, we're only 3 episodes in. And like I said before we recorded, I didn't quite get to finish the 3rd episode. So I don't think we go beyond episode 3 of the movies, but we're squarely in the middle.
Yeah. No, I did manage to squeeze in episode 3, and it's pretty much within the same time frame so far. So, so that kind of sets the stage, and I'm enjoying it so far. We were just kind of looking this up. There are 16 episodes, so they're only about after the first one, which is about 70 minutes. They're only about a half hour. So I'd like to try to get to them all because I have found it pretty compelling. It took me a little bit to get used to the boxy animation character design, which I know goes back to Clone Wars itself. I had trouble with, there was a Clone Wars animated feature as well, which just had that, the animation wasn't quite working for me, but I think, it's progressed since then. And there are some nice touches, even like the blaster, sparks from the blaster shots here that are really tactile. And we get, as we usually do with Star Wars, these world designs, these landscape designs that are really well rendered. So are you hooked so far by what you've seen?
I am. And a lot for the same reasons. I saw the Clone Wars feature. I took my then very young son to see it in the theater, and it's not a good movie. And then I ended up watching a lot of the Clone Wars episodes with him. He was really into it back when they were new. And I remember kind of, it was one of those things that it was on and he would watch it and I'd kind of go walk through the room and then get caught. I'm like, wow, these are some heavy sci-fi themes that are happening in this kids show. So I ended up watching a bunch of them. And so when I came back to watch The Bad Batch, I was impressed for precisely that reason. First of all, I think the animation is really good in this. I mean, there's not only those tactile elements in the blasters, but also there's like these painterly textures on the characters. Like you can almost see brush strokes around their faces and around their eyes. On all of their armor, kind of has that rough, burnished quality, which fits in that Star Wars aesthetic of this is a lived-in kind of rundown future. Well, past, but you know what I mean?
Right.
So, like a rundown industrial space. And so, it worked in that. And I think the themes that it's dealing, I mean, it is a children's show, no question about it. But the themes that it's sort of introducing to get to those adventures are surprisingly thoughtful. And so, I'm definitely in on it.
It is a children's show. I forget the rating that is on it, but I believe for violence. And as it explores some of those themes, it gets pretty intense. The 3rd episode, there's like some an execution, I can just say, that made me jump back and kind of realize this is for kids, right? Because it's exploring those ideas and does get kind of intense. And that kind of, brings us to this idea that I wanted to talk about. Star Wars, it's always been a militaristic sort of galaxy that we're in here. And even the rebellion, even the good guys, very, defined by their presence as a military. And I think even one of the signature sounds of the series is that of blasters firing. One of the defining elements is a weapon, the lightsaber. I don't know if you were like me, Joe, as a kid, where you would run around with a stick that was, supposed to be a lightsaber if you weren't able to get the real
and make
toy.
The sound effects with your mouth. Yeah. Oh, of course.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Yep. So, weapons have always been a part of this. And it even strikes me when we're introduced to the Bad Batch here. So this kind of clone unit that we're following throughout this series, they're kind of defined by their weapons initially. You've got Hunter, the leader, who has this knife that can cut through steel. Crosshair, as his name suggests, carries this rifle. He's a sharpshooter. Wrecker, I think, kind of mainly uses his fists or whatever blaster he can get his hands on. But he's like, he's a brutal man of action for sure. And there's, we meet them in the first episode. They have this training exercise they undergo, or they're put through, against these droids who have live weapons, and it gets pretty intense. And the money shot of that sequence is when Wrecker tosses the knife, Hunter's knife, in the air so that Crosshair can shoot it and send it slamming into the head of a droid.
Wrecker, knife!
So this is all kind of, defining them by their weapons and how they use them. And I think it leads to this overarching question as, the Bad Batch separates from what becomes, over the first episode, the Galactic Empire. They turn away from that and are trying to figure out their place now. They're sort of asking themselves, who are we going to employ our weapons for? And how are we going to do that? Is it going to be this Republic turned Empire? Is it going to be this nascent resistance we begin to meet? How did you feel about how the series has begun to explore that?
It's conflicted, I think, in its portrayal. We get in the first mission that they go on for the Galactic Empire before they quite decide that they're going to go on the run. They're dispatched by, I think he's Admiral Tarkin in this one, not quite Grand Moff Tarkin yet. They're dispatched by Admiral Tarkin to go kill insurgents. And they think that they're going to fight robots, which is who the clone troopers fight in most of their stories. And they get there and they find it's refugees, largely. There's a young version of Saw Gerrera, who some might remember is Forrest Whitaker's crazy character from Rogue One. We get a younger version of that character.
Oh, yeah.
Here.
Okay. Yeah.
and he comes up to them and he's like, what did you think you were going to find here? These are just people who, former soldiers, refugees, they say that word, who have been forced to become insurgents, is what he says. He gives them a challenge. And the framing, most of the visual language of the show is kind of standard Star Wars-y stuff. But there's this really interesting shot where Hunter, who's the leader of the Bad Batch, is on one side and you have Saw Gerrera on the other, and there's this light, some sort of equipment between them. And they're standing off while Gerrera's kind of giving them this mission. He's like, you can either, try to kill us and we're going to fight back. And he points the gun at him. And he says, or you can help us. And he turns the gun around and kind of hands it to them. And there's this moment where the two of them are standing with one another and there's this light in the middle and it's obscured by the gun. Hunter takes the gun, Gerrera turns off the light, and we get this shot of the five main characters, this kind of direct on shot as the light slowly dims on them. And I thought that was interesting because the clear conflict is sort of setting up is this empire that's promoting safety and order and security, that's their ethos that they're running on, is also insisting then that it kills anybody who does not fit in this. And these soldiers who have been taught and literally programmed for war are faced with this challenge of what else are we going to be? And that's really interesting. It kind of sets that off. Where it becomes muddled, I think, is they get a kid sidekick, this young girl named Omega, who is another clone, but she's a child. She's a young girl who joins them. And in the second episode, there's this opportunity for her to leave the group and kind of go on with other defectors, a former clone warrior who is, raising a family and become a simple farmer and trying to get away from the war. And there's a chance for her to get away from the soldiers and go off with him. And I mean, it shouldn't be a big giveaway to say that she doesn't. And the show really frames it as this moment of triumph that she goes with the soldiers, I mean, and in fact, her big moment in the first episode is when she picks up a gun and shoots somebody. It's a full-on hero, like a descending camera, music swell hero shot of a reveal that she has the gun and shot the robot. And so it's really conflicted. On the one hand, it wants us to consider, the cost of war and, how much regular people kind of get ground up in it. But it is still an adventure series, and it's kind of beholden to and a kid's adventure series, which means that we want to see the kid in action, And so the plots are kind of it's against one another in a way that doesn't always work.
Yeah, Omega is really fascinating as a character, this child, and I think even that moment you mentioned where she does grab the gun. They try to distinguish it because it's to protect, I think it's Wrecker, who at that point is very vulnerable, right? He's been shot, I think, and has fallen.
Yep.
And he is about to be killed. And so in that sense, you could say they're distinguishing, well, she did this and, it's a self-defense to save someone.
Sure.
And there's something maybe different there from how when guns are picked up at other times. Also, I will say, I think maybe a little later into episode 3, there's another instance where she picks up a gun, a blaster, and is going to use it when she's facing a creature. Try not to spoil it for you or anyone else. And makes a distinct decision about what to do, I'll just say. that is part of this ongoing conversation. I don't know that it solves it, but it is part of this ongoing conversation where they are trying to distinguish, I think, her relationship to weapons, which is pretty fascinating. But I'm totally with you. That moment where she chooses in episode 2 not to stay with Cut, I believe is his name, and his family on that planet, it's just like, okay, I get why they're doing it for the series, but it's completely the wrong choice for everyone involved.
Yep.
And so I'm with you on that. I do think that second episode is interesting in the context of Isaiah 2, though, and this idea of the vision of a world without weapons, without warring, because in a way, this is what we see with Cut and his family on this farm that he's been able to establish.
Absolutely.
So he is a soldier who has turned away. And I love how we're introduced to their little world, because Omega, who has always grown up on, the stormy planet of Camino, where it's always dark, always raining, it's a watery planet. She comes out of the spaceship to step onto this new planet where there's bright light, there's greenery all around her. And she's encountering all this for the first time. And you get, this for her is like a vision of, what the world could be other than what she's experienced. So I do think that's especially interesting. Of course, it's not an idyll. We see that Cut's land is fenced off because there are creatures there too that he has to provide protection from for his family. So it's not that this is particularly idyllic. We're not getting the kingdom of heaven here. But it is a sense of what that could be. I think that there's even a moment where Cut encourages Hunter, the Bad Batch leader, to leave soldiering behind.
So, where will you and your family go next? I suppose find a remote piece of land on a distant planet. That's all we really need. That's the key to not being found. You want to know how to disappear? Put being a soldier behind you and make a new life for yourself.
Yep. So I think the show is interested in exploring these questions. Again, maybe a little muddled in how it does want to handle them, or not quite sure itself how it wants to handle them at this point.
Well, it's beholden to genre. It's at the end of the day, it is still an adventure story set in the Star Wars universe, and those things have certain requirements. And I say, as a pacifist who loves super bloody horror movies, I don't think that you can necessarily throw out the thematic things that a story is trying to do while it's working within genre conventions. I mean, those conventions are still there. So I do think those moments have a lot of weight. Or an earlier moment when Omega is talking to Crosshairs right before he becomes a primary antagonist of the series because he is programmed to turn against his fellow soldiers. And there's this really interesting moment where she says, I know it's going to happen and it's not your fault. And she puts her hand on his shoulder, and the music kind of goes mellow and the camera drops down so we're on her level. And it's this sort of moment of forgiveness before the transgression happens.
Pre-forgiveness.
Yeah. And there's this sense there that the show's trying to push towards and trying to think something different. What does peace look like in a time of war? What does grace look like in a time of war? And I think that's true in all of these episodes. So as much as it's beholden to genre conventions, there are these bits that kind of push through, and it's clearly trying to rethink this thing as much as possible, which strangely is kind of relatable.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very Judas moment with Crosshair and Omega, isn't it, in a way? And I think he is an interesting character because that question arises, how much of his own will was it to turn on the rest of the Bad Batch, and how much is it part of his programming? So there's there's a whole nother rabbit hole we could dive down. I don't know if it'll explore it more as the series continues. I imagine it will. Is there anything else you thought we should touch on, though, Joe, far?
I mean, the last thing I'd like to add is that passage from Isaiah 2 talks about, before it gets to the swords and the plowshares and kind of bookending this thing, is this idea of learning, of learning from the Lord and being educated in the Lord's ways, and then, studying war no more. This kind of idea of, it's not a miracle or it's not a magic trick that happens. It's something that we have to learn because we are so. I mean, to think we're all locked into these sort of genre conventions, even in our real life, where we think of things as self-defense and antagonism and us versus them as normal. And there's this sort of renewing that happens, that's part of the Christian experience. It's part of the repentance. And I do think the show kind of pushes towards that with these programmed warriors trying to relearn how to go. And so as much as I'm being a little hard on the series with some of those muddled moments, I do think that's kind of reflects that relearning that we all have to do as we kind of rethink, well, if we're not going to use these as swords anymore, how do we turn them into plowshares? And there's going to be a process towards that.
Yeah, we do have a responsibility. We talk about the kingdom of God being free of war, free of weapons. And obviously it's not on us to bring that about, but we can participate in its coming about. And again, as fans of pop culture, maybe one early step of that participation is just to ask these questions about the weapons that we see and the warring that we see in so much of what we watch, and just, not let that kind of wash over us simply because it is part of the genre.
Yeah, or for our children, since these are kids shows, these offer us opportunities to talk about what our kids would do in these situations, how they feel about what they're seeing, and that can be a fruitful discussion.
Yeah, these things form very early on, don't they?
Absolutely.
In some of the shows we do watch as kids. I was introduced to Star Wars as a very young kid, so it's where I started first getting my ideas. It's why I picked up that stick, to be a lightsaber, because I thought that's what a weapon meant. So, yeah, that's a good point. Speaking, Joe, of you referenced being a horror fan, I know we were talking earlier this week about the new Saw movie, Spiral.
Yes.
Are you going to be writing about that somewhere else that we can at least point people to? We decided we're probably not a go for Think Christian, but I don't know if you're gonna do that somewhere else. At this
point, you'll just hear me ranting about it on Twitter. So follow me on Twitter, and I'm sure I'll bring it up. I've got a couple pitches out there, but so far haven't landed yet. So
okay, we'll do that. What's your Twitter handle again to remind folks?
It is at JAGeorgeII, and I'm going to see the new one tonight, so I'm sure to be tweeting about it.
Whew. All right. Better you than me. Good luck with that.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Take care, Joe.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Our good friends at Mockingbird recently put out the latest installment of their journal. They also run a blog and a really good podcast. And in the journal, David Zahl wrote about Isaiah 2 and described it as this surprise, the way it speaks against the way of weapons in the world, and envisions this kingdom, and I'm quoting Zahl here, where weapons will be rendered into farming implements, the weapons of war will be transformed, that which is used to destroy will be used to create. Hopefully our discussions on this show will consider Isaiah 2 and help you ask some questions as you go into watching movies and TV shows where weapons appear. And you can ask, how are the characters wielding these weapons? Why are they wielding these weapons? Are their reasons just? And how does the show or the movie's vision of weapons stand alongside Isaiah's? Those are all good questions worth asking, even for something like Star Wars, The Bad Batch. Now, whenever Star Wars comes up, I like to offer a reminder that we do have our Theology of Star Wars ebook. It's a collection of 9 essays covering the 9 main theatrical films, accompanied by really fantastic original illustrations that look great on a tablet. If you have not picked that up yet, it is free, and you can get it at thinkchristian.net/Star Wars. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If you want to leave some feedback, you can always email us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. We are on Facebook and Twitter too. You can find us at Think Christian. Now, for our YouTube viewers, you did miss out on a couple of tracks that John J. Thompson selected from his Spotify playlist. He compiled another playlist to accompany the theme for this episode. If you want to check that out, just search for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify. The Think Christian podcast is a production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you reframe your whole life through God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more information. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Bassett. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another corner of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.